We're going to rank the craziest human survival stories in history, from the absurd to the absolutely ludicrous. Number 1. The Revenant. What do you get when you mix a hunting trip with a one-on-one battle with an actual bear? Most times, instant death. Other times, we get the unlikely story of Hugh Glass. In his famous tale of survival, Hugh Glass was supposed to die in at least 1 million ways. In a situation like this, we can say that he was saved by the gods themselves. This mind-bending story begins in 1823 with Glass' fur trading expedition in South Dakota. While scouring the wind-beaten wilderness for game, Glass was attacked and mauled by a grizzly bear. He was beaten to an inch of his life. Luckily for him, the bear didn't finish the job. He was out cold for a few hours, and when he finally came back to consciousness, he realized his comrades had abandoned him. There he was, alone, horribly injured, and left for dead. The odds seemed impossible to overcome. How on earth could he get out of this? Like a true commando, Hugh Glass set to action. He was able to set his own broken leg and crawl to the Missouri River over 260 miles away. This survival attempt was straight up brutal. In order to stop his limbs from going rotten, Glass had to let the maggots eat the dead flesh in his wounds. By the time he got to the Missouri River, he was able to construct an improvised raft, which he used to drift downriver to Fort Keogh. The incredible journey took 6 long weeks. For food, he ate wild cherries and edible plants. At the end of the day, he was found and helped by a friendly Native American tribe. They helped him sew bear hide to his back to cover his exposed wound and helped provide him with food and water. By the time he got out of that wilderness, Glass was basically a legend. Even Leonardo DiCaprio left behind his supermodel girlfriend to create a movie about Mr. Glass. Number 2. The Robertson family. What would you do if you found yourself in the middle of sea with no food or water? During one of your daydreams in the past, you probably would have cooked up a scenario, kind of like this. While it's unlikely that anyone could survive a situation like this, all 6 members of the Robertson family were able to survive being lost at sea for 38 days. Dougal Robertson was a British dairy farmer who wanted to take his wife and 4 children out on a boat trip. The 6 of them jumped on a sailing ship and set off on their exciting journey on the 27th of January in 1971. Dougal had no particular destination in mind, except for the potential adventures of the wide open sea. And according to the father, he made a lot of preparations for the trip. He was a former member of the British Navy, so he knew his way around the sea. The family managed to get along pretty well for 17 months at sea. The little sailboats traveled from port to port and they enjoyed the views of the world. However, disaster struck on June 15th of 1972. They found themselves off the coast of the Galapagos Islands when a group of killer whales attacked them. The angry whales damaged the boat so badly that the ship started to leak water. The ship basically sank in an instant. Unfortunately for him, Mr. Dougal was not prepared for this kind of emergency. The only emergency equipment they had on the ship was a lifeboat and a small dinghy. Food supplies were ridiculously low, with only 6 days' worth of supplies available for the entire family. That situation, that was bye-bye. Out on the open sea without supplies, there's almost no hope for survival. Surprisingly, again, they all made it out alive. In what became a miraculous survival tale, how were they able to survive these trying times? Well, it took a little bit of creativity. They survived on turtles and rainwater they could catch. Dougal was also hoping that they could ride the Pacific currents to the middle of the ocean, which would allow them to push forward to the Americas. Within a very short time, however, things started to get much worse. It was basically a horror movie. Just 16 days after they were attacked, the raft was no longer usable. This meant that the family had to move the small dinghy, a 10-foot boat which was too small to carry them all. They were packed so tightly in that boat that even sardines in a can would seem like a better option to them. Somehow, they managed to cling to their lives until they were discovered by Japanese fishermen on the 23rd of July in 1972. Eventually, the entire family returned to their everyday life. If it weren't for the Japanese, the Dougal family would be swimming with the fishes, if you know what I mean. Knows that in poor taste? Whatever, bite me. Number 3. The Wild Boars Thai soccer team. Now, let's talk about what happens when soccer players decide to channel their inner Dora the Explorer. In June 2018, 12 members of a Thai youth soccer team decided to explore a nearby cave after soccer practice. Before you start blaming the young and adventurous boys, you should know that the entire thing was actually their coach's idea. This particular cave was called the Tam Luang Cave, and it was one of the longest caves in Thailand. The young boys ages 11 to 16 were dashed into the waters and they began to explore the inner depths of the cave. Like all young boys all over the world, they pushed deeper and deeper into the cave. and eventually they got trapped when a flash flood came bursting through the caves. With their only exit blocked, they were forced to go deeper and deeper inside. Eventually, they found an elevated platform which would protect them from the flood. All they could see around them was water. Apparently, the flood had filled the cave completely, and the unfortunate boys were trapped there for 17 days. For the first 9 days, they had no food or drinking water. In order to survive, they had to drink water dripping from the roof of the cave. Although the young boys didn't just sit and wait for death to come. You realize that there was no way out of this. Well, they took turns digging a large hole into the cave wall. In order to stop thinking about their need for food, the boys had to meditate to save energy. And the plan didn't work. They were stuck for good. And when it seemed like all hope was lost, the brave heroes of the Thai Navy SEALs burst into the cave to rescue the boys and their coach. When it was time for the rescue operation to start, the boys realized that surviving that long was only half the battle. They now have to figure out a way to get each player through the dense cave. Over the course of 3 days, the Navy SEAL divers are able to retrieve each player and their coach. The journey to the entrance of the cave was anything but easy. Each boy was required to wear a full-face diving mask and swam between 2 divers. The swim took hours. In the underground darkness, they had to squeeze through extremely tight spaces in order to escape the maze. It's a good thing that none of the spaces were too tight. How would the divers explain to the people waiting outside that one of the chubbier boys wasn't going to make it? Thanks to the efforts of the brave divers, every single boy survived and returned to a normal, healthy life after the rescue. You think you would have survived something like that? Some of us probably would have given up the moment they saw that flood coming and just let the waters take them. Hey, don't feel bad. I would have been one of them. Unfortunately, one of the Navy SEALs did die in the rescue efforts. This goes to show you that when you play deadly games, you win deadly prizes. It's unlikely that any of those boys will ever enter a random cave again in their lifetime. Number 4. Ernest Shackleton's 800-mile journey in an open boat, 1916. Very few things have happened in the cold wastelands of Antarctica. None of them have been as legendary as the unlikely survival story of Sir Ernest Shackleton in 1916. Shackleton was an explorer who took off in 1914 with nothing but an old ship and a dream. The dream? To become the first man to cross the continent on foot. While others were dreaming about inventing the next flying machine or an infinite ice cream machine, Shackleton was obsessed with, well, walking. Unfortunately for him, his mission ended before it even began. By November 1915, the ship had been crushed by sea ice. It was basically the Titanic before the Titanic became famous. Lucky for Shackleton, the end of his story was not as bad as the Titanic, but the middle was just as scary. He and his crew of 27 managed to survive, but they found themselves stranded on an island made of a sheet of ice. Somehow, they managed to make it to a tiny, uninhabited island called Elephant Island. This is where Shackleton decided to go back for help. He wasn't the kind of captain to let his crew die of cold exposure like a bunch of sea crabs. He gathered 5 of his bravest men and sailed on their largest lifeboat over the roughest sea in the world. They faced every possible disaster imaginable, from hidden icebergs to roaring tsunamis. The freezing and sore men were able to pull through for 2 weeks of punishment. When it seemed that all hope was lost, they spotted the coastline of South Georgia. This basically meant that they were saved. Several weeks later, they managed to secure a ship to rescue the men left behind. In what would be one of the most inspiring survival tales of all time, all 27 men actually survived the ordeal. While Ernest Shackleton never achieved his goal of walking across Antarctica, he is remembered for something far greater. It takes leadership to abandon your original goal and take on a new goal. This amazing survival story lasted over the course of 2 years, and yet all 27 men survived. 2 years, but everybody lived. That's crazy. If Shackleton and his men had spent any more time on that ice, they might have all turned into popsicles. Sadly, Shackleton died in his second attempt to cross Antarctica. Hey, I guess the man was obsessed with ice. Yeah, you can't really blame him for it, can you? It's a bit of a silly death as all deaths go, but hey, he was trying to do something. He had motivation and purpose. Number 5. Julian Kopke. These days, it's not only angels that can fall out of the sky and live to tell the tale. On December 24, 1971, Julian Kopke's life was forever changed. It started when the commercial flight she was on was struck by lightning and broke apart over the Amazon rainforest. And while that might sound like the premise of a real good movie, it was real life. It happened. It can happen, apparently. So, yeah, at just 17 years old, Julianne plummeted 2 miles, strapped to her seat, falling through the canopy and crashing into the dense jungle below. All of a sudden, she was thrown into a high-stakes survival game with nothing but an airplane seat to keep her company. Miraculously, she survived the fall with only a broken collarbone and a gash to her arm and her right eye swollen shut, but that is it. Dazed and alone, Julianne was lost in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. For 10 excruciating days, the teenager survived on small rations and her own urine, battling intense heat, torrential downpours, and hordes of insects as he tried to locate rescue. She needed to think fast, or she was at risk of losing her life. Using the life-saving techniques her father had taught her about finding water in the rainforest, Julianne did something that no one else might have thought about. She followed a stream upwards until she finally came across the crew of Peruvian loggers who had saved her life. It seems almost surreal that she was the only one who survived the plane crash. Did Julianne make a deal with the devil when she was younger, or what's going on? Is she just impossible to kill? Is she a Terminator? Who knows? All we can say for sure is that is one of the craziest survival stories ever. The kind Peruvian loggers transported her to a village, after which she was airlifted to a hospital. After getting healed, Julianne helped search parties locate the crash site and recover victims' bodies, including her mom's remains. Whew! This young superhero deserves all the accolades she can get. And sympathy, too. Yeah. Number 6. Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa. The survival stories in this list have come to pass, all odds, right? And this one's no different, of course. On October 13th of 1972, an Uruguayan Air Force plane carrying 45 people, including an amateur rugby team and relatives, crashed into the remote Andes Mountains at an elevation of 11,800 feet. The plane had inexplicably run out of fuel, clipping one of the highest peaks and slamming into the side of the glacier tail. Out of the 45 people on board, only 28 unlucky, or should we say lucky, people survived the initial crash. Among them were Nando Parrado, who was 22, and Roberto Canessa, who was 19 years old at the time. Over the next couple of months, the survivors went through all kinds of unimaginable horrors. Being in those brutal, freezing conditions, it felt like there was no hope left for them. How were they going to get out of this? With just meager rations of chocolate and wine supplementing the eating of the flesh of deceased passengers, the remaining survivors saw their numbers dwindle from cold, injury, and starvation. An avalanche on day 61 killed 8 more, leaving only 16 alive. It was then that Parrado and Canessa realized that their only hope was attempting to walk out. On December 12th, with only scraps of a fleece jacket, a pair of scissors, and an old glass bottle, they set out on an intended 10-day trek across 38 miles of freezing peaks and crevasse-riddled glaciers. They endured harrowing blizzards, injuries, severe dehydration, and exhaustion with practically no gear for 10 grueling days. Against all odds, Parrado and Canessa stumbled across a Chilean huaso, which is basically what we call a cowboy in the remote mountain valleys. Thankfully, he leaped to their rescue. Their miraculous survival after 72 days in sub-zero temperatures with no food, no supplies, is considered one of the most incredible endurance stories ever. This story sounds remarkably similar to Julianne's story, and it seems to have happened around the same time. Could it be that maybe some aliens were messing with some planes back then? It's just a little bit of a theory. Sorry if it's insensitive. Anywho, if any of these survivors get a hold of those aliens, it might be the end of the line for them. Parrado and Canessa might have survived that encounter, but it's possible that they still get panic attacks anytime they step into a plane. Number 7. Apollo 13, 1970. Space travel is scary enough as it is. But when your spaceship blows up, the difficulty gets to an entirely different level. This particular tale of survival was record-breaking because to this day, no other living human being has ventured as far into space as the crew of Apollo 13. They went to the dark beyond and lived to tell the story. So, what happened? When Apollo 13 was launched on the 11th of April, 1970, it was supposed to be the third vessel to land on the moon. The crew consisted of Commander Jim Lovell, Lunar Module Pilot Fred Hayes, and Command Module Pilot Jack Swigert. Their mission was to explore the lunar surface, but fate had other plans. The Americans were pretty excited for the launch, but little did they know that a critical incident was about to unfold. The crew never made it to the moon. To say it was a disaster is an understatement. 2 days into the mission, an oxygen tank exploded. The impact from the explosion disabled every single life support system on board, and the crew was left in hot trouble. With half of the spaceship blown up, the crew of the Apollo 13 had nowhere to run. Time and food were running out pretty fast. They only had rations for a day and a half worth of food for 2 people. Somehow, they managed to make it last 4 days for 3 people. Maybe they had some secret space candy hidden away somewhere. Who knows? But the brave astronauts had to steer their ship away from the moon in order to use the gravity to slingshot back home. They used physics to save themselves. The cruise path took them 248,655 miles from Earth before swinging back down. Apart from being dangerously low on food supplies, the astronauts were faced with a massive logistical problem. The spacecraft was rapidly moving off course, and they had no way to stabilize it. They had no control. They were also quickly running out of air supply and energy to their damaged fuel cells, which meant that a successful re-entry into Earth's atmosphere was becoming, by the moment, more and more impossible. Eventually, their sorrow turned into a victory when Apollo 13 successfully landed in the Pacific Ocean with the entire world watching. In this saga, all 3 astronauts managed to survive. The 3 of them could have easily turned into a triple roast turkey special while wrapped in that container, but it seems that fortune was on their side. Do you got any survival stories that'll make these ones look like child's play? Let us hear them in the comments. Also, let us know which of these situations you think you could survive. But let's be honest, it's very likely that you would die in every single one of them, as 90% of the listeners would too. People, we really tend to overestimate ourselves. But this shit, spooky. Anyways, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel to watch more like this in the future, and I'll see you later.